can the panel speak on the differences in both clinical and regulatory perspectives between the U.S. and Europe? I think that's a broad topic, but I don't know, Jerry, do you want to start out?
Sure.
Having had experience in both arenas?
Yeah.
The special reference to the harmonization which was occurring in 1996?
It's an interesting question because if you examine the RX tier products that are sold around the world, the U.S. has Restasis. Japan has a product that is sold there that is a version of hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is, as you know, a material that's used inside the eye primarily here in the U.S. as a item to keep tissue separate and to keep the cornea from collapsing onto the iris. It's sold as an RX product in Japan. And in Europe, there are a number of products that are sold as RXs. Most of them, though, are grandfathered as RXs, and at least to my knowledge, have not withstood the scrutiny of prospective clinical trials that Restasis and the product that's called Hylan have withstood in the respective jurisdictions that I've just mentioned. Likewise, over-the-counter artificial tear kinds of products are sold differently in different jurisdictions. Here in the U.S., they are regulated, as Dr. Chambers has said, by the OTC monograph that defines the actives and then permits or gives some liberty, I will say, to the inactives that are added to those products. And so there are a whole host of compounds, many of which, in my opinion at least, are somewhat or even moderately active in dry eye to be marketed here in the U.S. Those same products cannot be advertised as artificial tears in Europe. Rather, they're sold as devices and they're sold as comfort drops. And instead of having an indication for dry eye, they are sold for the relief of the symptoms, something that Oliver Shine was talking about. They are sold for the relief of symptoms of a particular disease. And they are sold with a CE mark on them, as opposed to having been reviewed by the regulatory agencies within the individual countries. Those of you familiar with the CE mark process in Europe know that it is a quasi-government certification that you get whenever a CE mark is applied to a product, but still it's not the same as having a regulatory review or having an OTC monograph. So what I would say to you in summary is that, at least in my opinion, it is a checkerboard of a situation that we see with both RX and with OTC tier products in the three primary areas of US, Europe, and Japan. I'm not familiar with what else is sold in all of the other countries around the world, and I'm sure that there are exceptions as well as conformities to the kinds of products that I've talked about. But those are the three primary areas that companies look at in terms of gaining approval: the US, Europe, and Japan.
Dr. Chambers, do you want to add something to the differences between the way you guys look at things at the FDA and perhaps the way it's looked at the EMEA?
No, in many aspects I don't know how the things are done in the other countries.
I mean, one thing that that I seem to run into quite a bit was that in Europe that there was a strong directive to do your pivotal studies versus an active control rather than placebo, and I don't know if that's generally a difference that's ever been discussed between the agencies, or if that was just kind of my experience and it doesn't hold more generally, but that seemed to be one major difference that often didn't, required us to do separate trials in Europe and the U.S. to test the same drug.
The concept of trying to do active controlled trials has been more heavily pushed by the European groups than it has been in the United States. Some of that is done for evaluation of costs and be able to place it from an economic perspective, which is not within the purview of the FDA. There is no objection to doing active controlled trials from the United States perspective as long as you can set this non-inferiority margin, but that ends up being a dominant factor in not being able to do a number of active controlled trials in the United States.
Question insofar as working both with Jerry and Les at Elkhorn and Allergan over the years, and you're focused strategically on worldwide registration as part of your drug development strategy, and while you recognizing that sort of major pharma, perhaps less so with the startups, but let's say for many of the smaller startup companies, the question would be to the three of you, would you recommend, and at what point would you recommend a international registration strategy for your clinical program and data collection?
Well, I think in terms of a strategy, it's important to define that early in the process, because there may be opportunities to leverage the design of especially your pivotal trials, so that they will support registration in multiple jurisdictions. So that I think one should examine it carefully. Often, in our case, we found that that we had to use different trials for some of the products in different jurisdictions, and then it becomes a question of the economics, and and also the focus of the company. Where do they want to launch the product first? Where are they strongest? Where do they think they can get the best return on their investment? So I think it's a combination of those, but I think it's very important to strategically look at the question very early on, so you don't miss an opportunity to include something in your trial that might, something small that might allow you to more broadly register your product.
I would just add that I believe global registration of dry eye products is probably going to be more complex than global registration strategies of, say, an antibiotic or a glaucoma product. One of the confounding factors is that in the U.S., you have an agency to go to and you have an individual to talk to who in most cases, or maybe because he was here beside me, I will say all cases, provides clear direction about what requirements are. But coming back to seriousness, that doesn't exist in Europe. With the rapporteur and co-rapporteur process that the European agency uses to review all submissions today, you are basically without clear direction unless you seek formal guidance. And then the formal guidance process becomes in itself complex and difficult and a lengthy one in terms of getting feedback from the central agency that's called the CPMP. So it is a different kind of regulatory situation that you face in Europe if you go there to try and register a dry eye product, because you will get a potpourri of basically the requirements that the individual countries that make up the EU want to have in a submission. So whatever you think the requirements are here in the U.S. and the difficulty that you may have associated with them, I would simply say to you that it very well may be more complex in Europe than it is in Japan, than it is in the U.S. Now, with regard to Japan, my experience has been, and Les can comment on this as well, is that in Japan, you're going to have to repeat some or all of the efficacy trials anyway. Japan has opened the door, and if you can show that the pharmacokinetics of your drug are similar in two populations, yours and the Japanese, then you have a shortcut to approval. But with a product like a dry eye therapy, where systemic levels of the drug may be very low from topical administration, that route is going to be a difficult one to pursue. So I think in many ways, as difficult as the route may be to approval for a dry eye product, the U.S. still may represent the most expedient way to that goal.
Well, we're running up against that danger point here where we're holding you back from lunch. But before we leave, I want to thank all the panel members, and especially Dr. Chambers, for spending the time with us here today and sharing some important insights into dry eye development. Thanks very much.